Atramedes, once considered one of the more difficult hard modes in Blackwing Descent, has gone under a lot of recent changes that make him a much more viable option for guilds just starting out on a hard mode progression, and should be considered as an alternative to Chimeron for your second heroic mode encounter. This guide assumes you are familiar with the mechanics of normal mode, which can be found at our site, availguild.com. On Heroic, Atramedes has a 10-minute enrage timer, but you're much more likely to run out of gongs before you run out of time. That's because on Heroic, Nefarian will often destroy another gong when you use one, meaning that you can only reliably use 5 or 6 gongs throughout the encounter. This makes managing your sound absolutely crucial and the only difficult aspect of this encounter. On previous versions of this encounter, the sonic discs would bounce off the wall and return back to the raid, making dodging them a lot more hectic. After a recent hotfix, these no longer bounce and instead leave the room. The discs also now always target a player and head out in that direction, meaning that a raid stacked up will always have to dodge all 4 discs. This change was made to discourage raids from stacking up in the corner or doorway. As such, your entire raid should spread out in a circle around the boss, remaining close enough for healers to reach both sides. This fight only requires 1 tank and 2 to 3 healers. We suggest using 3, with 1 being a Holy Priest, who can manage the gongs in Phase 1 so your DPS can stay on the boss, and can body and soul targets of the Fire Beam in Phase 2. Sonic Breath functions the same as it did on normal, but with much less forgiving damage and sound. Even 1 tick of the breath will almost certainly lead to your death from modulation. The breath should always be run either clockwise or counterclockwise, and this should not change from each attempt. This will allow your players to know in advance whether they need to move. Atramedes will often continue his breath as he turns back to face where he started breathing. Because of this, players should avoid standing where the breath started or risk gaining 40 sound. Modulation now hits significantly harder and the damage scales harshly with your sound level. The amount of sound you gain from modulation averages around 20, depending on how much of the damage you resist. So as long as you avoid discs and breath, you'll never have so much sound that you can't live through all of Phase 1 without using more than 1 gong for Searing Flames. Searing Flames does very rapid damage now, ticking once at the beginning of the channel and again a second later for significantly more damage. The raid can handle at most 2 ticks, so the gong clicker needs to be in position and ready to click 10 seconds after the first sonic breath. The damage is fire and a Holy Paladin can have Aura Mastery up for each Searing Flames, making surviving a second tick, should it occur, a lot easier. An Obnoxious Fiend will spawn from a portal twice in Phase 1. These adds have 150,000 health and are not targetable at first. They will rapidly run to any random member of the raid, including the main tank, and jump on their back. Once there, they become targetable, and begin spamming an ability called Obnoxious, which generates 10 sound per cast on the target. This ability is slowed by Curse of Tongues, is interruptible, but casts through stun. As of this point in time, Obnoxious is stopped by Solar Beam's Blanket Silence. These fiends need to be taken down immediately, and should never complete more than 2 casts. Phase 2 begins shortly after the second sonic breath and requires near-perfect execution on Heroic. Your primary job in this phase is to make sure that you are constantly moving. The sonar bombs that are placed around the room now move significantly faster, exploding a second after being placed. A player who is not moving when the bomb is placed on them is sure to get hit. This fight is not a difficult DPS race, and the focus during this phase should be on moving and avoiding these bombs. It's also important to make sure you do not run in front of or even near someone else, as this will almost certainly cause them to get hit. Atramedes' beam still gains speed rapidly on their target, but every air phase should be easily manageable with only 1 gong. Attempt to have the person kite the beam in a way that causes the fire to be as unobtrusive as possible. Good spots include along the walls or back to where Atramedes spawns at. Note that the beam always targets the person who hits a gong in the air phase next, so it's best to have a mage or another very mobile class click the gong in the air phase, as they'll have the easiest time of avoiding the fire beam. The fire that is left on the ground by both Searing Flames and the Fire Beam in Phase 2 now ticks exceptionally hard. It is still possible to run through the gaps and avoid it, but taking 1 tick should be avoided unless absolutely necessary. Overall, this encounter is a much easier bet than any other fight in Blackwing Descent currently. You can find up-to-date information as more hotfixes are applied along with other strategy guides at our website at availguild.com.